Shalom everyone. This video is about the influences and the dynamics behind the scrolls. The scrolls that were written to give us today's Bibles. So when we think about the scrolls, a lot of times we don't think about how powerful the pages of the Bibles are that came directly from these scrolls. Now, the scrolls have, for centuries, gave society direction, influencing governments, influencing family values, influencing the world. So when we think about the scrolls, we have to think about what actually helped shape the world that we live in now. I asked the question, explain the influences of the way the Bible has shaped the world. An AI overview says, the Bible has profoundly shaped global, but I like to use the world's civilization by influencing law, education, arts, and morality for millennia. As the world's best-selling book, it laid the foundation for Western ethical systems, human rights, and social institutions like hospitals and universities. It has inspired artistic expression, literature, and political movements worldwide. Key ways the Bible has influenced and shaped the world include legal and political systems, biblical principles, particularly from the Old Testament, influenced the development of Western law, concepts of justice, and the foundations of constitutional republics. Let me read that again. It says, biblical principles, particularly from the Old Testament, influenced the development of Western law. Now, I spoke on that before, and I try to get the viewing audience to understand that when we think about law and the judicial system that governs complaints and cases that's brought before it every day, the principles come from and the foundation comes from the Bible, which came from the scrolls. The question asks, did the Bible come from various Israelite scrolls? And it says, yes, the Bible, specifically the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, originated from a collection of various Hebrew manuscripts, scrolls, and for centuries, oral traditions, rather than being written as a single book. Let's look up the definition of the scroll. Here, 5612 in the New Strong's exhaustive concordance of the Bible, we're going to go to 5612. 5612. Sefer. Sifra. Writing, the art, or a document. A book, bill, book, evidence, learned, learning, letter, register, scroll. 5608. Safar. Prime root, to score with a mark as a tally or record. To inscribe and also to enumerate. To recount, celebrate, commune, account, declare, number, penknife, reckon, scribe, show forth, speak, talk, tell, out, writer. The scrolls that I'm speaking of are the biblical scrolls, not to be confused with other cultures that use scrolls at different times in history. These biblical scrolls are the scrolls that help define the world and how you define good from evil or clean from unclean. Just to show the influence of this scroll, it has went as far as being defined architecturally. Here we see another word for scroll. Here in the Oxford American College Dictionary, we read about the word volute. Volute. Architecture, a spiral scroll characteristic of Ionic capitals and also used in Corinthian and composite capitals. But those capitals are defined unto themselves. This design is the volute or the scroll. I asked the question, what is the connection between the Volutes and Israelites? An AI overview says Volutes, specifically in the form of volute capitals or Proto-Aeolic capitals, are a signature architectural feature of the Iron Age kingdoms of Israel and Judah, representing a distinct local royal style of the First Temple period. These carved stone spiral-shaped motifs were used to adorn doorways, gates, and palaces of administrative centers, signaling power and sacred space. So here where it says proto-Aeolic capitals, sometimes, as I said before, they will show you the volute or the scroll, but sometimes they'll add some other shapes, and it could be confusing. But the volute capitals is in reference to the scrolls, and not just any scrolls, the scrolls that we get our Bibles from, the biblical scrolls. So I needed to bring out that influence of these scrolls even in architecture. Now, all over North America, we can see these scrolls in the architecture. So this can't be denied in terms of those capitals were put there to let the world know that this is Israelite architecture. This is the Museum of Science and Industry here in Chicago. Right now, I'm here looking at the volutes, or the scrolls that marked Israelite palaces, Israelite hakels, Israelite authoritative buildings. They want us to think that these buildings were built by Europeans. I asked AI Overview the question, was the Museum of Science and Industry a part of the 1893 Chicago World Exposition? It said yes. The building that houses the Griffin Museum of Science and Industry was a central part of the 1893 World Columbian Exposition in Chicago. Serving as the Palace of Fine Arts, it is one of the only remaining major structures from the White City still standing in Jackson Park. Let's look at some more fabrication. It says, temporary materials, staff. The structures were not made of stone, but rather staff, a mixture of plaster, cement, and jute fiber applied over wooden frames and steel structures. This allowed for rapid construction, but meant they were not designed for longevity. So if you've ever been to the Museum of Science and Industry, you know that's not temporary. The truth of the matter is that one building that was in that expo was made of permanent materials. In ancient times, it could have been one of many authoritative buildings right here in Chicago. So, never let anyone tell you that this building was built in the 1800s based on the 1893 World Exposition. Let's read this. The one exception: the Palace of Fine Arts was built with more durable materials, brick, due to insurance requirements for the art housed within it. This building still stands today as the Museum of Science and Industry. This is how the expo was exposed. So if that's the case, why did they tell the world that the buildings that were built were made of temporary materials? In other words, why would the exposition expose themselves in this huge fairy tale? If this building or those buildings that were built before the 1800s, and the only thing that these contractors or workers went in and did was paint the existing buildings white and patched some voids that were in the existing architecture, why are they taking credit and telling the world that they built these as a temporary exposition? Look at the lions, the tribe of Judah. All around this building. So yes, let's talk about the tribe of Judah or Yehuda. The symbol being all around what's called today the Museum of Science and Industry. By that building and other buildings that were on display at the 1893 World Exposition, a lot of those buildings were a part of Israel. They did a reset in the 1800s to convince you that these buildings were built specifically for that expo. That's not true. We can't rely on that. We have to stay with what we see in terms of ancient architecture. Now, when you see this, I know we've been taught a lot about excellence, so-called black excellence, coming from Africa. But right now we're talking about the continent of North America and how royalty was right here on this landmass. They continuously want you to believe that the royalty came from another continent. That's not true at all. You got to understand, Israel was right here on the continent of North America. You can't forget that. But the thing is, a lot of us don't know this. Why? Because it was erased. right now, the Gentiles have taken it upon themselves to put themselves in these key places that talk about the royalty and the grandeur that was already here in North America, who you call so-called black, the black man and woman. The descendants of these royal bloodlines. Now, when you read your Bible, you see that there were other cultures, so-called black cultures, that were here in North America. You read about the Canaanite. You read about the Ishmaelite. You read about the Egyptian or Mizraim, the Cushite that was right here in North America. But right now, we're talking about the Israelite or Israelites that ruled this landmass, that carried over into other parts of the world. You cannot ignore the biblical scrolls. The scrolls have a way of continuously exposing the truth. And this truth will never be extinguished. The thing that happened to the so-called black man and woman was when we were deterred and convinced to walk away from the Bible or the biblical scrolls. For those who don't know, the biblical scrolls is what civilized this landmass and other land masses across the world. Always remember that Yisrael and the biblical scrolls have always been the beacon of light that would show the rest of the world which way they should go. Here's a photograph of some of the buildings that were a part of this expo. I just can't understand how you have existing structures of this grandeur, and you tell the world that it was built for a temporary expo. Look at all these Gentiles that were pushing and shoving to get into this expo because in ancient times, this Gentile was probably not allowed in or around these buildings. This would be their first glance as a species, because the Gentile had to break barriers to come into mainstream society. There was a lot that was done in the 1800s that reset or made an adjustment to the historical narrative. This is the grandeur that they're trying to take. Why would you build something this grand just to tear it down? That makes no sense whatsoever. But today, the exposition is being exposed. I found this commentary quite interesting. The title says, an 1893 demolished advanced city tries to hide history. Now, as we scroll down, and it reads, everything was done with horses, hand tools, and human labor. There were no bulldozers, trucks, cranes, or concrete mixers. There were more than 200 buildings, miles of roads and rail, lagoons, bridges, and electric systems. Structures were said to have been made from a plaster-like material, staff, a mixture of plaster, cement, and jute fibers over wood frames. And that's what I question. But note the size of the people compared to the buildings and the sculptured detail and scale of the buildings. Let's take a look at that. Look at the people. Look at the size of these buildings. Again, look at the people. Look at the scale of this structure. That makes no sense. They keep trying to simplify the materials that were that were used to build these structures. But look at the scale, look at the size of this building. That's just part of this so-called expo. Look at this. Look at the detail. Okay? Now let's look at the detail. I haven't even scratched the surface to the real history of this expo. Look at the people. Now, these are people going up these steps. Look at the size of this. And you telling me that they built a lot of these buildings, or all of these buildings, in 2 years. See, some of these buildings, or part of these buildings, could have actually been patched to fill in voids, to make them presentable to the public, but the excuses that they're making doesn't make sense. Look at this individual here. Look at the size of this building. Look at this. Look at the detail. But you're telling me that these buildings were temporary. This history has to be questioned. What are they hiding? Here we have a photograph of the so-called temporary, or the aftermath of these so-called temporary structures that was a part of the 1893 World Exposition, or Columbian World Exposition. Now, when we look, we're looking at brick. Do you see this? This doesn't look like temporary material. So what are they telling us? You see this brick? This doesn't look temporary to me. What we're looking at in this photograph, and all of this debris, is brick. Solid building materials. Look at this. Look at this structure back here. Look at this. This doesn't look temporary. Look at this. And we've read over and over again that these buildings were built for this exposition out of temporary materials. Look at this. This does not look temporary. This is brick. So we can't keep letting historians lie to us, and just continue to tell us anything they want to tell us. In these photographs, we're looking at today we call the Museum of Science and Industry. But this is the condition in which the so-called museum was found in before any renovations, any new or what we want to call upgrades that was done to it for the 1893 Columbian World Exposition. The so-called Museum of Science and Industry was found in this condition because it's an ancient building. You can see the antiquity of this architecture. This was not built in the 1800s, as they want you to believe. You can see that this architecture is very, very old. This has nothing to do with staff or temporary materials like they want you to believe. This building shows that it was ancient. This is another photograph. These are photographs they don't want you to see. This building has stood for centuries. They've lied and they've called it all sorts of names. They've renamed it time and time again. Now, in the days of what's called the Columbian World Exposition in 1893, it was called the Palace. I'm going to say it again. The Palace of Fine Arts. Way before it was called the Museum of Science and Industry. Do you see the antiquity? This building was already built. You see the columns? This is right here in North America, in Chicago. They've lied and told you that this was made out of staff or something temporary. No, this building has stood the test of time. But they need to perpetrate the lie because there's a lot to hide. You see the volutes? These are the volutes that signify ancient Israelite architecture. This is, again, in Chicago, in North America. It can't be denied. This wasn't built in the 1800s. These photographs are very rare. I came across these photographs because this video had to be made so that you would know that Yisrael was here in North America from a very long time ago. They want you to believe that it was a part of this expo so they could continue the lie. This building has been here, again, for centuries. Here's another picture. See the volutes? Or the scrolls? Look at the age on this architecture. As I said before, never let anybody tell you that these Gentiles built this. This was built for the children of Israel. So understand that this is extremely important because the Most High would not allow them to destroy this completely. Why? Because it had to be brought out so that the lie would be exposed. It's time to wake up. Challenge these narratives anytime you're faced with these lies. Every time you see these lies, confront it, because now you know the truth. This is the proof that the so-called Museum of Science and Industry was already here. With the volute as a testimony to its authenticity. As I've said before, this building is extremely old, bearing the marks of old age regarding architecture. This stands here in North America. The lie is that so-called European, better known as the Gentile, came to the Americas and brought civilization. That is an outright, utter lie. This building has stood on this land as a testimony to the scrolls, which represent the Holy Scriptures that we have today. This is what they're hiding, or this is part of what they're hiding. But these scrolls have stood the test of time. If you want to know about the history of North America, it's in your Bible. That founding father, 13 colony history is fairy tale. This is the true history of North America. You can't hide it any longer. The 1893 World Exposition, or World Columbian Exposition, brought you fabrications about the architecture that was here. But those lies are coming to an end. This cannot be denied. So when you ask yourself, what is it that they're trying to hide? This is one aspect of what they're trying to hide, is buildings being here before they say they came. If that Gentile was here in this region of the world called North America, he was a slave or she was a slave. They don't want to tell you. They don't want to tell you that. They don't want the world to know that they had to serve individuals like this man. This is what they're also trying to hide. The so-called black man, or the Israelite, being a ruler here in North America, having these pale Gentiles as their servants. That's another thing that they're trying to hide. So they don't want you to know that there was an Israelite or Israelite architecture here, because those volutes are on all kinds of structures all across North America and the world. The historical community does not want you to know this. And just so that you know that this protocol of this so-called black king, which was an Israelite, is coming back to take its rightful rulership. And these pale Gentiles will have to fall into a subservient role again. So if you like the video, subscribe, push the like button. And with that, I shall bid you shalom, peace, and prosperity.